I'm really, really, really excited about this presentation and having you guys here. So I do encourage to get involved and ask away. I'll turn it over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy, and you guys at the Global Hemp Association for having me talk today a bit about biofuels and hemp. So what I wanted to do is I have some slides to guide some discussion. I've been researching the topic for some years, and so I just want to show you guys where I think we are with creating a biofuels industry out of hemp. So this is a little bit about my background. I'm an innovation manager, and I've been an engineer for 20 years. This is a project that I had through my graduate degree, and then when I left school, I worked for Siemens Corp as a postdoc, and I developed some technology that was based on membranes and fully integrated it into an LED light. And this is actually a magazine article from their Pictures of the Future magazine in 2010. And this had to do with me taking that membrane and vertically integrating it into an LED lighting product that we made for the high bay lighting industry. So this shows where I was in the earlier part of my career leading a global product development team at Siemens to develop a new product in the emerging LED lighting market. I went on to spin this company out of Siemens and sold my interest to a private equity group. And then after about 2013, I started looking a lot at chemical processes in the Cannabisea family. And basically my thesis back then was that for the industry to scale, we kind of needed to look at how to make these processes cheaper as you scale up the size of the batches you're processing. And this is kind of like whether you're talking about the oil resins for the CBD compounds, or if you were talking about chemical processing in biofuels. So I was looking at this time at market opportunities and how to make lines of businesses within the hemp industry. So nowadays, if you fast forward to now, we have a lot of opportunity from the US government where they're looking to stimulate the biofuels or the sustainable economy. And like some of these things are like recently there's an article that say Joe Biden wants to release $400 billion over 10 years to stimulate a more clean energy and more innovation in our US economy. There's for projects where you're actually implementing equipment at a large scale, you have like the DOE loan program. There was a recent article from Jigar Shah, who's in charge of this loan program now, and they're talking about these ways where they stimulate innovations that maybe are out there but haven't been tried at a large commercial scale yet. And then, of course, we have the USDA through the NIFA program that has a bioprocessing and bioenergy topic, and they're doing about $5 million a year for early stage research. So there you have these different layers of research and development, and there's even the SBIR programs in the US that look at small businesses. And this is a breakdown on the right of the fiscal year 2019 amounts they were allocating from the different agencies. And of course, if you were doing something with biofuels, you might be looking at the Department of Energy, the NSF, or the USDA. So at a high level, if you look at the biomaterial pathways, so this is like very high level, what I'm trying to cover here with this group at Global Hemp Association is, first of all, we're talking about chemical pathways and how you actually end up with a product. And I want to give some examples of commercial equipment, and then maybe discuss some new technologies that are out there that could impact the development of the hemp market when you're making biofuels, and talk a little bit about market models. So this graphic here kind of shows that in general, if you're going to make some biofuel out of hemp, you're either going to be looking at a lignocellulosic portion of the crop, which is the stalks, or you might look at the oils and fats, which would be if you let the female seed, you would get hemp seeds, and then you would use those hemp hearts, and you could use the shell and the hearts to make oils and fats. So typically what's happening is you're going to have a large amount of biomass, and then you're going to do some pre-process, and that you might have a primary product, but then along the way, you're going to move what comes out there into these different pathways. So you might have like C5. And so basically, when we look at where we are with what we're going to make out of a crop, you're looking at the carbon length typically. And then if you're on oils and fats platform, you're going to be like looking at like a renewable diesel. If you're looking at lignocellulosic, you're going to move more towards bioethanol. So this is an example of a bioethanol plant. And this is the classic way of making bioethanol. And what you'll see here is like you'll have a storage, and then you'll have a mill, a conveyor belt that you're putting this up into a bin where you're going to grind it up. And then you have to break down the lignin. And basically there's a chain where you're breaking those carbon chains down from lignin to carbohydrates to sugars, and then you can ferment. Now, a lot of the reason why it's really hard to make lignocellulosic bioethanol has a lot to do with what goes on right here in this cooking and fermentation, because when you're trying to break down the crop, it takes, usually they're doing this with like a sodium hydroxide, or they may have like a high pressure co-solvent fractionation, and it's very time consuming and energy intensive. And the more energy you put in these steps, the less economics you have on the other end, because you have to do an energy balance. So this is an issue here. And then what happens is once you get the fermentation done and you've created an alcohol, now you have to refine it. So you have like a beer still where you're trying to get the alcohol to be purified and remove the solids into a stillage. Now, then once you can get this first pass done, you run into a technical problem. Ethanol and water have an azeotrope, and they don't want to come apart. So then you have to have a next stage where you're trying to get yourself all the way up to pure ethanol. And that's the second stage where you're having a fractional still, or you're trying to crack this azeotrope. And that might even happen with mole sieve, molecular sieve. Now, all these processes take heat. So whenever you apply heat in a chemical process, you have to pay for that energy, and it takes off of basically it's going to drive up your operational costs. So here's an example of like how you could innovate these processes. And I'm just giving you some examples of things I've been working on over the years. So one is that if you started with hemp as the feedstock, you can use a process called PEF. And I've worked on this process, and it actually it's a high intensity electric field that cracks apart the bonds in very small pulse durations. So you can actually, instead of using a sodium hydroxide, you can pull these bonds apart with an electric field. And then another area that's commonly looked at now for splitting these lignin into carbohydrates and into sugars is they're using ionic liquids. And this is actually, there's a big research group in Berkeley that's a federally funded research center, and they're looking at this for several years now. This ionic liquids is actually what we call ugly salts, and it's where an anion and a cation, I'm sorry, I'm not in the camera, they're different size, so they can't crystallize as a salt, and they have very high fields in there, so it pulls organic molecules apart. Now, where I work on membranes, and I sell membrane equipment, and you can use membranes in various places in this process where you don't use the heat now. You're utilizing a membrane to pull chemicals apart with a polymer surface, and that tilts the advantage and the energy favor. So you're using less energy to make these biofuels. So there's one area where I've developed membranes is where you're reclaiming solvent from so you can actually purify ethanol with just a membrane instead of evaporation. And then I have membrane technology that we work on where we split azeotropes with advanced membranes. So you get rid of the need for the heat intensity at this azeotrope splitting. So when you're trying to make bioethanol, you're going to be looking at, the feedstock cost, breaking down the lignin, and then the energy balance. Okay, so why are membranes important, right? So this is on the right here is a graphic from Evan Shively. This guy wrote this paper in Nature in 2016, and it talks about in the United States, we use about 98 quads of energy industrially. A quad is 10 to the 15 BTUs. These are huge numbers. But in the industrial sector here, let me get rid of my face. There's about 45 to 50% of the 55% of the energy is consumed in separation processes. And then with the advent of global research around membranes, you can save, like in some cases, 90% of this energy by utilizing membranes. And that's why I focused on this innovation area. So here's a piece of equipment that I have delivered in the hemp industry that utilizes membranes. And I was the first in the market to develop this and deliver it at an industrial scale. And you can see where I'm splitting hemp crude oils by utilizing a membrane, where you used to do this with freezing, and you would split over 24, 48 hours, but I'm doing this in real time at over 10 gallons a minute. So here's like a little video.
Can anyone else hear the video? I can't hear the video.
Okay, I think that's enough of that.
Okay.
So I think what I'm showing here, I'm sorry if the video wasn't clear to everybody, but what I'm showing here is basically implementation of membranes to save energy in chemical separations. Now, on the pulse electric field side, this is an example of where I worked with a German food institute called DIL in 2017. And what we did is we were applying pulse electric fields to hemp. And what we did it for was to create a way to dry hemp at room temperature and volume. And that's very important because right now, when people harvest hemp, they usually either lay it up in the field, hang it in barns, or they use convective dryers. But I had developed a way with this group to basically apply electric field, open up the cell walls, and the water can express out. And then you can save energy in drying by quite a bit. And you dry, like basically the first squeezing step removes about 60, 70% of the water, and the rest expresses out when you lay it up at room temperature. So this process can be used in biofuels. And the reason why you can use it in biofuels is you can use this process to break down lignin. And here I'm showing a patent that I received in the United States in 2018 on the application of PEF to the Cannabaceae family of plants. So the idea here is to drive down the OPEX cost on the front end of when you're making bioethanol. Now, this is an example of hemp waste in the US where you have these waste centers. And like, I just want to point out that in 2019, there was about 68,000 tons of hemp and cannabaceae that was disposed of. And this happens for many reasons, but right now there's not really a lot done with this material. So this could be made into feed for animals. This material could be made into bioethanol. And what I'm trying to do is I'm saying, what's my call to action? Well, I'm looking for people that are interested in trying to put these pilot programs together to take hemp into a biofuel and set up pilot programs. So here's, I'm going to talk a little bit about combined heat and power and give you guys examples of equipment. So this is combined heat and power is where you take, and you're taking the biomass, and what you want to do is you want to create electricity. So the first pieces of machinery here are from a company in Berkeley, California. And these are already in existence, and they sell these machines to, for example, countries like in other developing countries where people aren't close to the grid. So here's a 2 kilowatt platform, a 25 kilowatt platform, 25 kilowatts of electricity. It's about $2 per kilowatt. So then there's examples here of machines where you can take the biomass in and do 130 kilowatts. Now on the right is even a more this is a machine that they're working on in California, and this is a Next Fuel is the company. They're doing torrefication platforms. So this is really interesting where they're taking, and torrefication is the process of heating a biomass up in the absence of oxygen at like 200 to 300 degrees C. And then you basically get all the moisture out and you compact it and you increase the energy density. And they are claiming that they can make biomass that is now on the energy density of coal within 30 minutes. So these are combined heat and power innovations that are directly available that, for example, large amounts of hemp could be put through to make combined heat and power. Now, this is an example of biomass to hydrogen. And this is a company out of Japan, and they actually have, pilot scale systems all the way up to full industrial scale. There's one of these going into Bakersfield, California. And what you do here is you put biomass in, and this advanced refining platform is making the biomass and making hydrogen out of it. And it actually uses some innovative ceramic beads to help with the energy transfer and then the snarfing out of other chemicals to purify the hydrogen. So this innovation, I think, could have a big play because hydrogen is like a syngas for other fuels and can also be put into electric vehicles. Then biodiesel is another area that's of interest in hemp to biofuels. And the process for making hemp into biofuels is this: like you take and you have a hemp seed and you dehull it, and then you'll do an oil press. And then you're going to take this hemp oil and you put it with methanol, and then you use a catalyst to create transesterification. So the catalyst can either be like sodium hydroxide or it could be an enzyme. And when they first started with sodium hydroxide, really the problem was it takes a long time. The byproducts you get are a glycerin layer and the triglyceride layer in methanol, and they're usually really dirty. So because of this taking a long time and being very expensive on the OpEx side, in recent years, there's been a lot of work on enzymes, and these enzymes would do the process cleaner to where the glycerin layer is almost clear. And then at first there was mobile enzymes where the enzyme's floating around in the reaction vessel, but then it gets everywhere. So then they were like, there's a lot of research on immobilizing the enzyme. So you then can do the process more at room temperature, and you get a cleaner separation between the glycerin layer and then the triglycerides. Now, your triglyceride is essentially what's called fatty acid methyl ester. And if you didn't do anything to it and you separated it, you'd have B100. Now, typically when we make biodiesel, you're talking about grades of mixing the biodiesel from, B20 is 20% of the biodiesel and 80% of classic diesel. Now, one of the things that happens here is when you take and as you increase the amount of biodiesel, the NOx goes up. So it's harder to pass the ASME standard for fuel. But so when I would look at this field and I say, well, where are the innovations here? Well, the innovations, a lot of them have to do with new ways to do the enzymatic process. And then also there are people that are looking at applying membranes. So I can apply membranes to split these chemicals here when you do glycerin and the triglyceride methanol layer. So I can make a membrane system that actually would split those two so you don't have to wait for them in a chemical separator. So that's exactly like the machine I showed you a video of where I'm splitting chemicals. Also, in the refining process, you can utilize membrane technologies that I developed. Okay, this is an example of a small scale pilot system that was in 2013. It was from Texas, and they were making biodiesel. This was about 1 million gallon per year system, around 700,000 gallon to 1 million gallon per year system. It was working. The smallest system they made was 50 liter per hour, which is kind of small. Now that one had a capex of about $100,000. Back then, it was fully integrated. It had like the transesterification process as well as some distillation built in for refining. Generally speaking, B100 is about $4 a gallon. Now you could get a renewable fuel standard credit of $1 to about $1.50, and they've extended that to 2023. And then if you're ever going to make biodiesel, especially if you're going to do a distributed system like you were a hemp farmer, you'd want to have something where potentially you're using the immobilized enzyme and you have a platform that you could put directly on site. So this system didn't use membranes in there, but you could use them to get a better OpEx. So this is a slide here that's just about feedstock crops versus sustainability. And then here what you have is like, basically most of the bioethanol we do is in America is with corn. And it's a more expensive crop. And then if you went down to less expensive and more sustainable, you'd have lignocellulosic biomass. So that would be more like hemp. And the problem with the lignin cellulosic biomass is what I told you is it's hard to crack the lignin into the carbohydrates and the sugars. So that process needs innovation. Now, this is a chart here from where I'm showing you for biodiesel in 2019, how many millions of pounds of these different crops were used. And you'll see that like the majority of everything in America is soybean oil is what if there's any biodiesel made, it's that. There's some corn oil and canola oil. But I think what I would say about this is hemp is in the nascent stages. And most of the time, you have to be careful about your free fatty acid content when you get an oil resin, because if you go with the classic sodium hydroxide method, it depends on whether you have saturated or unsaturated free fatty acids in the transesterification process. But with newer immobilized enzymes, it doesn't matter. You can have either one of those. So I think in general, this says to me that there needs to be a broader pilot program for hemp in the US because we're in the nascent stages. This is the bioethanol feedstock in America, and this has to do with the most prevalent ethanol feedstock is corn stover. And so this is a survey I ran on the NREL website to show you where the bioethanol plants are in America with the green dots and how many millions of gallons per year they are versus where the corn stover is grown. And you see that the whole industry is right where the corn is grown, right? So now if you had hemp, could hemp be put into action across the US, and could you have a more diversified energy generation system with bioethanol? I think so. And then I would say that one thing that's very relevant right now, there's an article here from a couple of weeks ago, like the commodities are blowing up in America. Corn over the last year has doubled in price. It's 50% more than it was last year. Wood is 4x more than it was last year. And actually, if you look at the biofuels, a lot of what they talk about in recent reports over the last decade was either wood as a biomass for biofuels or corn stover. So I think this is an opportunity for hemp where if you have hemp as a byproduct after you make something else, like say hemp seed oil, or maybe you're doing lignin for fiber for automobiles, but then you take the rest of the biomass and you were to make bioethanol. Could we create an industry here? This is a slide here that all these studies, I've read many studies over the last decade, and these are like the billion-ton study to understand how to have 1 billion tons of biomass in America to make a biofuels industry. And this billion-ton study was updated a couple times over the last 10 years. Then there's, NREL reports. There was this whole like $50 million Sun Grant initiative to look at feedstock crops in America. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. None of these reports ever looked at hemp. And I was like, well, why don't we look at hemp as how it compares to these other feedstock crops? So just so you can see this, like in 2013, I wrote a report for the Thai government, and I was looking at different feedstock crops that would be made for the Myanmar. And in this study, I looked at the supply chain analysis for both the agronomic modeling, the decortication, and then the fuel production. And I did a trade-off study between palm oil, sugarcane, miscanthus, hemp. And so this was almost, now we're almost 10 years ago I did this report. So I had enough foresight to look at hemp as a potential crop for biofuels. That's all for me right now. That this is my equipment that I make at Ecosce for refining with membranes. But in general today, what I'm trying to do is just stimulate some conversation about hemp as a biofuel. So I'll just open the floor for people's questions and discussion.
Joke's on me. I was on mute. Does anybody have any questions right now? There are a few that were dropped in when everybody registered that I can go over, but any questions? I'd love to open this up. Artie, I saw you nodding your head lots.
Yeah, it's very impressive to hear this presentation, Ahmed. If you can hear me, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm in kind of a noisy kitchen as I'm doing this Zoom session, but very impressed with your thoughts and you're data-driven. You understand that government hasn't been focused on what the future really looks like. So as my new role now to Power Unity, which is an entity that's going to help stand up the entire national hemp industry in an unbelievable short time frame of trying to do in 24 months what many in the industry say could take 10 years. And we want to go raise $1 trillion to do it. And we have many great people on our team that have the scientific minds to take a look as you're doing at the current technologies used with other feedstocks for creating these biofuels and saying, how can we make a better mousetrap? And we're going to get there very quickly because of all the people represented on this call and others that we have at our team and others that we don't even have connected today. But we're quite excited about getting to a real understanding and what are the weak links in the supply chain that really help us get there. See the day that all of our tractors are being powered by hemp biodiesel, for instance. And what is that impact going to do on other commodity prices such as corn and soybean when we start to recognize hemp as that third crop that in the Midwest can be very important and will significantly reduce acreage of those other crops. So I want to see a lot of studies and emphasis put on to moving us in a direction of doing the data to see what the day looks like and model out significant lower acreage of corn and soybeans with hemp replacing those acres, getting us off of this thought that we need to do a 30 by 30 plan being promoted by the USDA to idle 30% of our tillable land in the United States to get us to carbon emission standards when they haven't even contemplated, in my opinion, seriously at the USDA. What if we simply just converted those acres into hemp production instead? Can we not generate a lot of carbon credits that also get us towards the goals we want with carbon credits, but also provide another infusion of cash to support our family farms across the United States? For those of you that don't know me, I grew up on a farm 25 miles north of Denver growing corn, sugar beets, alfalfa hay, and barley for Coors. And in 2016, after attending my second NOCO Hemp Expo, I decided it was time to help launch hemp cooperatives of farmers across the U.S. It's taken me until this year to finally find the right team. And I'm proud to be helping put it together that is going to effectively get us there, get us these co-ops of growers that can be consistently growing for us year in and year out. And I was impressed yesterday on a call with another friend whose group is probably represented on the Zoom session today to understand now that we have the big companies like Exxon and others ready to jump into the biodiesel market and allocate 10% of their production maybe soon into supplying the needs of hemp biofuel to specific customers. And the federal government, I believe, has already committed to doing so. And we have some funding through our group in California that's coming to the table to pay farmers a good price per acre to grow hemp. And so we're just excited about the direction it's going, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get introduced on this call. And I think there's a lot more to explore, and you're taking everything in the right direction.
Thank you.
Awesome. Scott, go ahead, and then Bruce.
Okay. Hi, Ahmed. This is really cool what you're doing here. Two questions. First is, what kind of membranes are you using in your process?
When I basically make a piece of equipment, the membrane type changes for the application. In the recent years, a lot of what I've been doing is there are spiral wound elements that are polymeric, And they actually, if I could pull it, I can't pull it up right now because that would take forever. But basically, you have a laminar sheet of different layers, and they have a layer of spacer, and then you have a nanofilm, and then you put the nanofilm on both sides of the spacer, and then what happens is the fluid gets in the middle that can permeate, and it goes down this thin sheet into a permeate tube, where then it can go out. So you have one in and two outlets. That's the most common membranes that I'm using. They're 8-inch by 40-inch, 80-40 style. So they're like 25 meters square to surface area. Now, some applications that I'm looking at, like, for example, if I'm cracking an azeotrope, I switch to different material systems because I may run at high temperatures under partial vacuum. So I may be looking at ceramic systems. So there I'm using like a ceramic system where the pores are literally on the order of angstroms. They're like 0.4 nanometers. They're very, very tiny, 0.42 nanometers, because you basically kind of split atoms.
Right. Cool. And then the other question I had was about the glycerol that you wind up with as a byproduct. Do you have a use for that?
Glycerin is a very common food additive. It's used all over the place. Like the glycerin is a lubricant. There's a tremendous amount of, for example, let's say COVID-19 recently happened. A lot of those hand sanitizers, the base was glycerin, right? And then you just put an alcohol in there. So there's a tremendous amount of applications for glycerin. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious because a friend of mine has a patent out of Australia to make bioepoxy from the waste glycerin from biodiesel products. So he's got a 100% plant-based epoxy with no VOCs or anything, and it's a great upcycle for that product.
Bruce, great questions, guys. And then Jason, I saw you're off mute after Bruce. If you wanted a question, Bruce, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mandy. Scott, I'd like to talk to your friend about the glycerin-based 100% bio epoxy.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ahmed, great presentation. Thank you. I had two quick questions. Number one, have you calculated what you think the difference in carbon footprint would be if the world were using hemp fuels instead of petroleum fuels? Or that's kind of a general high level thing, but more of a realistic application, right? Of where you see the real market might fit fairly shortly. And then also what the premium is going to be required. So say if it costs, the consumer or the farmer 10% more for this fuel, it's going to be in the billions of dollars, and the government might have to pick up something like that. So what is the economic premium that would be required to widely adopt hemp fuels? Thank you.
Okay, so to address your first question, a lot of why we're trying to look at, like, say, hemp as a biofuel is that hemp itself can be a soil remediator, and in general, you're going to have a better overall carbon footprint than any fossil fuel. So that's a lot of the reason why when you look at the way the biofuel economy works, what happens is you'll get a credit from the renewable fuel standard for every gallon you make of these fuels. And then also you can become an energy services provider, and then you'll have companies that utilize too much carbon, say like Amazon running all their trucks around America to deliver us packages. They then buy in to guys that are producing negative carbon. So you basically can get a power purchase agreement from these larger corps that have a worse carbon footprint. Now, you ask me, have I done the carbon balance on all those processes I gave you? The answer is no. I have not. I could do that, and I have people in my network that do that for a living. For example, there was just recently an ARPA-E solicitation, and they're looking for brand new technologies to change the energy landscape. And I was communicating with people in that network who specialize in the carbon footprint balance. And just so you know, there's some interesting research going on at UC Davis. And at UC Davis, they're doing research where they've created a futures model, and they look at if the policy for renewable fuel standards were to change and reflect for different crops. So if they change, the leverage towards corn to say hemp, they study the futures model of what that would do to the energy industry and the commodity price, the amount of production. So they do these Monte Carlo simulations of the future of the market based on these impacts of carbon footprint and the renewable fuel standard. So there's a tremendous amount of really cool predictive modeling and energy modeling that's going on, but that's not my particular focus. I'm more of a process developer.
We want to talk to those guys too.
Yeah, you get them on the line now.
Yeah, I want to know that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ahmed. Yeah, I appreciate that. Great answers.
Anybody, Jason, did you have a question you wanted to share or anything?
Yeah, I would love, I have one question. Actually, I have a lot of questions, and thanks everybody in the industry on this call. I think we all know that hemp is the future, and Ahmed, amazing presentation. When you did that study for Thailand, and you were, in that study, you're basically doing side-by-side comparisons with all these different, basically, sugar sources really to create these biofuels. Where did hemp end up in terms of that, side-by-side comparison? Because I think we all know that growing hemp, whether it's just for the soil or the amount of less water that you would use versus corn is pretty valuable. But I've also heard this, like switchgrass could actually be more viable for biofuels. So I'm curious where hemp landed in that that study you did 10 years ago.
So there were some things that I determined back then, and let's talk a little bit about the motivation of why they started talking to me in the first place. Thailand had, there's a permanent Thai commerce minister that I was talking to, and the king of Thailand is one of the richest people in the world. And he basically said, we want to do some biofuels. So they just went to Malaysia and copied the Malaysian model of, for example, planting palm to get palm oil. And then by the time they got their plants commissioned, which means the equipment was stood up, they're ready to turn on, the commodity price of these things fluctuate. So then it became not profitable to actually turn the plant on, even though they built it and paid for all the equipment. And then they were like, wow, we lost a lot of money. What happened here? We don't understand what we did exactly what they did, but there's this idea of scales. And then there's also the fact that commodities fluctuate. So then they were like, well, they wanted to then invest in Myanmar because Myanmar just does whatever Thailand does because they got more money. So they're like, okay, we want to get some business going on over there. So let's talk about what we could do different. So what I was doing was I was trying to understand the difference between predicting a commodity in the future and then how much fuel you can get per amount of biomass. And what I found out was that some of these commodities were fluctuating highly. And one thing was if you looked at sugarcane and, for example, versus hemp, you have less market fluctuation with hemp. So you could predict the future better. So that was one thing I learned. Another was you look at the different paths of taking hemp. So if you took it and looked at the hemp seed oil from a seed versus say soybean, you find out that hemp seed actually has more oil per unit seed than soybean. Right. And then you go through each of the processing steps and you try to figure out how much kilojoules per liter you can get. So I drew some conclusions about that. And in general, what I found was that hemp was a pretty good product at the time because there was not as much commodity pressure. So they could probably hit the window where when they get to the market, they're not smashed by the commodity going through the roof. The other thing is you talk about these other switchgrass products like Mycanthus is one. So let's talk about that. I showed them in that report that if you grow a crop for one reason, let's say you grew it for bioethanol and you grew this Mycanthus, and then what happens if that business plan falls apart and you have no way to monetize that field? Well, with hemp, I was showing them that there was 3 ways to monetize the crop, right? So you could sell it into technical fibers into Europe because a lot of the body panels for Mercedes were being made in Thailand. So they could take and get a technical fiber contract with an automotive company. And actually they were making more money on that than they were on the biofuels. So you're hedging it, right? So there's the hedging function and then the commodity stability that I determined. And then there was the idea that if you actually let the female seed, you could make an oil extract and you can make that into a fuel. So that's the goal, is if you grow a crop to not have one thing you're doing with it, because you usually get hammered then.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Rich, and then after Rich, Terry, if you're available after Rich.
Just wanted to know if some of the same machinery, whether transportation, whether the same piping that they use is something that could be used mixed in with the same fuel they have, or does it have to be separate?
So you got, when you make a fuel, right, at the point of production, there'll be standards, right? And before you can get into any pipelines, you have to pass those standards. So for like biodiesel, it's like, I think D975 and D6785. And what these have to do with is all of the different readings that they take on say a biodiesel. So if you can pass that standard, and then there's the blender. So at the producer, you make say B100, then the blender takes 20% of that and puts it with classic diesel. Now it can go in the pipe and be shipped wherever it wants. Now, typically people aren't running a lot of vehicles on B100. They run it on B5 or B20, right? If you're doing diesel. And then with ethanol, if you make ethanol to where it's basically anhydrous, then you just have a product there, right? That product can go into many things. It can go into paint industry. It could go into, you could put it into the alcohol industry. You could put it into flex fuel where they mix it with gasoline. So once you have it to anhydrous and it's pure, you're fine, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Terry, I'd really like, and then after Terry, Kevin, I saw you raised your hand as well, but I'd love to introduce Terry and hear your feedback as well. Joel, are you after Kevin then? Did that your hand raised as well? Cool, I'll call on you after you're done. But yeah, Terry, you're on mute if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Hi, I'm Terry Walker. I'm a professor of biosystems engineering at Clemson University, and I've been working in biofuels for probably about 15 years, and also high value products and like omega-3 fatty acids, those type of things, looking at different type of extraction technologies. I've started out with the supercritical fluid extraction with carbon dioxide. And still working in that area as well. But I'm also trying to, we're working on hemp biodiesel in the laboratory, and also at my house, since we've been sort of isolated here, of actually making fuel at my home and trying to make it easy where any farmer could do this. And I've successfully been able to do this with the oil, waste vegetable oils, and then hopefully get to larger quantities of hemp oil as we start extracting more over time. This is an example right here. I'll just show you a wash fuel that I'm actually running in my Dodge Ram truck.
Yeah.
Cummins engines are great for running. You go up to 100%.
So I see your separatory photo. Is there a little bit of a separation there?
Yeah, there's this water at the bottom, but actually the glycerin does look a lot like this as well. It is very clean, just as you talked about with the enzymes. So I'm using a Novozyme Aversa enzyme, which is actually it's a free enzyme. It's not immobilized. So they've had a number of immobilized types as well, but this one works really well and is relatively cheap. So
yeah, the immobilized enzymes are very expensive compared to the free floating ones.
Right. Yeah. So there's been several small industries to develop around those free enzymes, and there's one in Fort Myers that I'd visited several years ago. I think they shut down, unfortunately. I don't know exactly what happened there. They've actually had several different issues. They moved from one place to Fort Myers and looked like they were doing well. They were like a 100 million gallon facility there. So it was So I think it is the future. And I was able to convert this fairly easily. I actually used E85, and the gasoline that's actually in this, which I didn't like, but it's hard to get ethanol without the E in the form of E85 is a fairly cheap form. But it actually does work as a co-solvent, so it seemed to speed up the enzyme reaction a little bit, which is interesting. But so
you're not using methanol as the working fluid.
No, we do in our laboratory at Clemson as a comparison, but we're mainly trying to move to ethanol as the alcohol, which there are some issues for separation that you have with using ethanol. And it's also not, the methanol is right now cheaper, so this is why they're heading that route, but it's not really sustainable. Except for I was able to get some methanol out of Canada that came from a gasification type process where they took waste from paper waste out of a landfill and converted that to methanol. And then very expensive though, unfortunately, but that's
I work a lot with methanol these days because some people in hemp are doing their refining in methanol. So I've worked with methanol and ethanol with these membranes that I put into production for splitting chemicals. Ethanol it's actually a little bit more challenging at splitting things off of it.
Right. Yeah, I just do it because it's sustainable. I'm trying to move it in that direction, and it works really well with the enzyme. So our traditional process where we use potassium hydroxide, which I think is slightly better than sodium hydroxide, because you can reuse the potassium, you can put it in fertilizer. It has a little bit more value as a byproduct. But with that process, it's very difficult. But with the enzyme, it works quite well because you have to have water in the process where normally you have to normally remove water in the potassium hydroxide process to avoid soaps. So you don't end up with soap formation.
There's a
lot of advantages, the clear glycerin and everything. So
the piece of equipment that I showed you, where there was years ago, there was a guy in Texas that was trying to make small scale biodiesel plants that were on the order of 700,000 liters, 700,000 gallons to 1 million gallons a year, where they were trying to make these smaller plants.
Right.
So I think that if hemp were to go where you had a lot of seed farmers, they're trying to they basically allow the female to seed, and then they harvest that, and they wanted to make small amounts of biodiesel. That seems to me as an interesting way to go, where you have these small scale plants. Because one thing I note about, I interviewed some guys that when I was getting my equipment made, I had to find people that would work for me. And I interviewed a group that had bought several biofuel plants in America in the 1990s. And what they told me was that when everybody got really hot and heavy on making an industry, they made these big plants, but they weren't profitable. And they did it the classic way, where they were using like potassium hydroxide, and they did it the textbook way. But then by the time they got into production, it just wasn't profitable at all. And the renewable fuel standard was up in the air, going down and up and down. They couldn't predict it. So then these guys that knew a lot about engineering went and bought like 10 of these plants in the United States and retrofitted them and made them profitable with different process technologies. So if hemp were to become a biofuel industry, it'd be nicer if in smaller distributed systems that are small machines, farmers find the innovations that work and are profitable, and then only you go make, a 10 million gallon per year plant, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of this comes down to economy of scale. And if you're just dependent on the biofuel, then you're probably not going to make it unless you have a very high quantity. That's the reason why these large biodiesel facilities were successful and the small ones kind of were bought up. But I think if you make this more into a true biorefinery where you're really getting lots of high value products, and you can play the market between your co-products and your fuel, and you're running your system off your fuel to make it renewable, to get energy credits, the carbon credits you had talked about, is probably the way to go to make it more of a distributed system, like what you're saying. And that's what I really hope for. in the future, but we're going to have to solve that problem. And I think hemp has a lot of potential because there's lots of high value products, co-products that come with this. So even if fuel is down 1 year and you don't get the RFS, so you lose that dollar credit, you don't end up going out of business because the CBD industry could be up, or the some of the other co-products, or high value products that you make from the herd. You can make biomaterials. There's lots of different potential avenues there, which I think it needs to be distributed because, again, transportation, you can't be too far away from where the hemp field is. So ideally, the farmer themselves becoming a processor or hiring a processor to work directly on the farm or near the farm would reduce the transportation issue. So that's leading that.
Yeah, well, like that system I showed you that they make in Berkeley, California, where you can basically put biomass in there, then you make electricity with a motor. So you're gasifying it and then running a motor, you make electricity. You just plug that back in the grid, and then the farmer is getting paid by the energy company. He becomes an ESCO, right? So those systems are reasonable because, that system I showed, let's say that pallet side system was like, I think
that's all power. Isn't that an all power unit?
Yeah, that's all power lab.
Yeah, I bought one of those. We have one at our facility. Yeah, it's really great. Yeah, that's a great company. I'm real impressed by that company, but because they've distributed their units all around the world to exactly, I think, what you said, to countries that don't have access to easy grid power. They can do off-grid power. So
yes. So I think in general, I think this idea of letting the farmers know that there are these technologies that could be piloted without, $1 million, right? You can get a loan for these things. And I think even in my state, there's a lot of, I'm in California, the state itself has a lot of loan programs and things where they're trying to, like the Clean Air Resource Board are trying to invest in promoting these things.
Right. And there'll probably be more of that. I mean, that's California sort of leading in that as a state. Hopefully USDA will catch up with them one day. They're always a decade or two behind. So hopefully there's no USDA people here. I like USDA a lot. I've applied a lot of their grants, but unfortunately it just seems like it's got to bring our government into the 21st century at some point soon. So we're already in 2021. We're too late at this point when it comes to global climate change. We've already messed up there. At this point, it's just a matter of drawdown. It's a carbon drawdown race at this point. So I would definitely look into these technologies. I think have a lot of potential towards carbon drawdown. So regenerative agriculture, I think, is going to be a real key, probably the biggest key component to that. And I think hemp plays really well into regenerative agriculture.
So real quick before we go on to our next question, Bruce, this may be a perfect time for you to introduce. We're doing a carbon discussion, and Bruce is actually, I don't know if he's even on. Tracy, I don't know if you, there you are. Hi, good. And it just happens to say Drawdown Hemp right behind you. You're on mute, sir, but I don't know if you want to introduce your project or what you're working on and kind of what our discussion is for June 1st. You're on mute. You're on mute. I see you laughing, Mike. It'll be you someday.
Thank you, Mandy. Yeah,
I got you.
A few weeks ago, Mandy and I were just brainstorming what's another great topic that a lot of people in the hemp industry would be interested in. And the whole concept of drawing down carbon came up. And so kind of brainstormed, let's have at least an initial session and see how many people are interested. And so that's coming up on June 1st. I think we've got something like 80 something people as the last time I checked were registered. And of course, there's a lot of stuff going on, like was just mentioned by Ahmed, the whole concept of reforestation, not reforestation, I'm sorry, but regenerative agriculture and growing hemp, etc., biofuels, making things like hempcrete, etc. All these things, they're all going to tie back into one simple thing, and that is they're all going to tie back to one simple calculation, and that's how much CO2 can we draw down the atmosphere, and help turn this problem we have around. So it's a big problem, and we have to kind of agree on what those numbers are. So it's going to be an interesting first conversation. So welcome everybody who would like to join us.
Yes, absolutely. And I welcome those figures, numbers, guys, we were talking about earlier. Anybody that has any of that. But Kevin, and then Joel, and then Michael. I know that there's a few lists. And Ahmed, I don't know where you are for time. We're at an hour right now. How much time do you have if we've got a few more questions?
I'm fine. If we,
okay.
I can go over the hour.
Okay, a few more questions. So yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Hi, thanks, Ahmed, for this setup. This is great. One main question I got is the similarities that we're talking about with the terrafaction versus pyrolysis. Did I lose you?
No, I'm here.
Sorry about that.
So you're talking about torrefaction versus pyrolysis.
Correct.
Yeah, there's three things that I showed. The all power labs things, that's like a gasification where you're heating things up and you're basically splitting the compounds, you're breaking down the biopolymers, and then you get basic elements that then are combusted in an engine, right? So that's gasification. Pyrolysis is typically, in pyrolysis, what you're doing is you're trying to, it's similar to gasification. You're splitting and breaking down the biopolymer, but in pyrolysis, a lot of times they might have a synthesis part of it where they're trying to get these say C2, C4, C6, and maybe they're trying to get them into a certain group so that they become like a fuel. That thing that I showed with the torrefraction, what they're doing is they're basically want to take the biomass and they want it to stay a biopolymer. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to yank out all the moisture to get it bone dry, and they put it in like a reducing environment like hydrogen, or it could be an inert gas like argon. And they are basically, I think that machine I showed you might even be a plasma that they're striking. And they basically then they're getting it to where you have a charred, or it's not oxidized, but it's like ash. It's like all black, it's carbonized. And then with it being then compacted, they're trying to make like a coal briquette. And then you have an energy density that's way higher than the biomass. Like biomass is like, I want to say, I remember these numbers off the top of my head, but like, I want to say it's 10 gigajoules per meter squared. And then with the briquettes, you get it up closer to 20. And then that's almost equivalent to coal. So they're by getting rid of all the water, so they're not breaking all the bonds and just and gasifying them in gasification or pyrolysis. They're actually compacting the thing to make a briquette. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does in some of it. What I'm looking at doing and developing is similar to the pressed charcoal you're talking about. And I'm making biochar. I'm setting up a custom design basically for a portable unit that can be taken to farms and make the biochar on site. And it's the accessory that I've been hearing about that does the actual heat capture and then condenses the heat to make a biofuel. And that's the piece that I'm most interested in, finding a way to make it portable instead of on a huge scale.
Yeah, I think that system that I showed that they're doing in California, that technology is quite big. They're trying to make like almost like a big production plant of these briquettes. I would have to do some searching to figure out how to solve what you're talking about. You would basically, when you start looking for stuff, first thing I do is make a flow diagram and look at the piece of the technology you're looking for. And then in the past, when I'm looking for a technology, the first things I do is I start with non-patent literature and then move to patent literature to see who's been developing.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I see that. Well, thanks for the input. I'm more focused on basically trying to do, like Terry was saying before, a small scale with localized and spread out with a lot versus big trucking all the big quantities in. So that's,
yeah, I think the thing is, I'm just not as familiar with what you're trying to do, so I can't really answer exactly what you want because I'm flying blind here.
right. I hear you.
I mean,
I feel like I'm flying blind too, though.
that all power unit actually does that. They advertise that. So it's small scale pallet type. It's a gasifier, so it produces electricity. Also produces hydrogen, carbon monoxide, so you can use the gases for that purpose, for heating purposes. So it's combined heat and power, and then it produces a high temperature biochar, which may be what you're looking for.
Okay, I think maybe you're connecting the dots for them there, Terry. So yeah, maybe that's what you want.
Exactly.
That sounds like a perfect thing for you if it's in small scale. And these guys have been doing it for 15 or 20 years, as far as I know, and they keep improving their unit every year. So it's we're just getting ready to move it over to our wood testing center. So
right. Oh, I'm definitely going to look them up, Terry. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's the three components that I'm looking for, basically. Well, I guess I can't think of the other question, so I'll let you go.
We'll be here. You can chime back in. Joel and then Michael. Joel, go ahead.
Hi. I have two questions. My first question is the size of acreage that is needed in terms of your pilot project. And the second question is, how much would the pilot project cost?
That's a great question, Joel. To be honest with you, what I was trying to do in the recent months, when I say a pilot, I've been talking to some of the transfer stations that exist in my state, and what I'm trying to do first is to look at the challenges that would occur if you had, say, hemp that people are bringing that was more or less disposed of, and if you try to make bioethanol out of it. And in that case, what you're doing is you're looking at stuff where, you're going to be looking at, thousands of pounds a day of processing. And at least what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at the fact that this might be funded by a state or government program in the U.S. government. And in general, what I think it's going to, these projects are like $500,000 projects to $1 million. And here's why. So I'm combining, as I put in that graphic, multiple steps, and I'm trying to get a read on the energy balance to make sure that I get a gain on the energy balance. Like I'm using less energy to make per unit bioethanol. And then the other thing you find out when you do this, if you didn't actually take this out of the field and people bring a bunch of biomass to a site, there's all kinds of challenges that occur. One of which is you'll find that people, a lot of times when they're throwing things away, it's because it might be contaminated with pesticides. And then all of a sudden, your transfer station becomes a waste hazard site, and you actually can get fined for putting toxic chemicals in the ground because you put a bunch of them there. So then all of a sudden, like my challenges become that not only do I have to create the study to figure out the energy balance, but I also might have to remediate chemicals that come out in the process of manufacturing a fuel. So the point of my project when I talk about a pilot is putting this stuff together to really understand at a individual site condition what it would take to make fuel, and then from there you scale it. So does that kind of give you a sense of what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, because
what you want to explain what you're trying to do?
I'm practically trying to do the same thing, but I'm trying to really bring the whole entire industry into Trinidad and Tobago. So let me give you a little background. So we have over 100 years in terms of oil and gas production. And they revamped the whole entire sector.
Where are you located, Joel?
Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago.
Oh, okay. I finally got it.
Right. So we have a production plant that produces natural gas. Now, from just 2 months ago, Shell is going to take over our refinery. That's in the process. Our Prime Minister, his background is in geology. So he's a farmer also. He has a large farm out on the Twin Island of Tobago. So he knows about the complexities of oil and gas and agriculture. When Amoco, Shell, BP, they were in Trinidad and Tobago doing oil and gas, they also push the agenda of agriculture. Now we have seen agriculture dissipate and just crash.
Oh, wow.
What I'm trying to do right now is revamp the whole entire sector and bring hemp into the play, because you're talking about biofuels, methanol. We have methanol plants, we have nitrogen plants, we have natural gas plants, we have oil, but we know that the construction side is what really drives our economy. So from you building a pilot project, you tend to create jobs and opportunities and raise the GDP. So if I can get that into Trinidad and Tobago in conjunction with what I'm doing, we can definitely build our economy and show the United States government, because we have strong ties here in Trinidad and Tobago with the United States government, that the hemp industry, this is what we're capable of. And we can get the OPEC, the Shell, the BP involved in the pilot project.
I understand. So I think at least the vision that I've had so far was not so grandiose. I was trying to do some research and development to basically prove out some of these technologies that I think can have a play. And I know they can, because I basically, you look around the world at what other researchers are doing. So I'm trying to just apply it to hemp. Now, in the past, I've worked on commissioning things, right? So I'll give you examples. I've worked on where people are building chemical manufacturing facilities, and I work as like a process designer, and I pick every step in the process and then pick what piece of equipment goes. So I'll give you an example of like I have a contract where I'm working with a pharmaceutical company in Spain, and they're getting into the CBD and cannabis industry, and I pick all of their equipment. And then basically those are big projects, right? Those are where you're millions of dollars. Like that project's $15 million for the chemical processing equipment, but $50 million for the whole thing. So, but that's not what I was planning at this point, because when you're doing hemp as a biofuel, I don't think at this point I would go and just spend $50 million on a plant, because you got to do what's called the unit operation process development, where you make sure you understand the process parameters of each unit operation, and then you scale up. So these things in Trinidad, if it's something you're trying to do over the next 5 years, that makes sense. But if you're trying to do something over the next year, I don't think what I know is ready for that kind of prime time.
No, it's really over 5 years. I'm really starting with the construction. Yeah. So the seed trial first, and then after we're going to go into ecotourism and into biofuels and those type of things.
Yeah, if you have a little bit longer timeline, then the stuff I'm talking about is appropriate. But whenever I'm doing build outs for people, I have to understand where they are with the timeline, because sometimes there's people, I just raised $25 million and I want to plant next year. And I'm like, man, it takes 1 year to design anything.
Definitely, because there are individuals who have done studies in terms of the biofuel and the methanol that's here, that has 35 years in the oil and gas industry.
Yes.
I can definitely get them involved in terms of having these discussions, in terms of bringing the pilot into Trinidad and Tobago. I also have a meeting with the Prime Minister to come soon. I don't know because of COVID restrictions and stuff like that, when that will happen. But these discussions that we are having right now, we can really force these major mega companies, because I know BP is doing something in the Atlantic with wind power. I know they have a pilot project going on right now as we speak, off the coast of England. So I have that type of information.
Joel,
Yes.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I have to go here in just a little bit, and I have 2 more questions. So I'd love to open this up and continue this conversation. Don't hesitate to. I'd love for them to come back to have opportunity to meet with, any of you, or set up appointments on the side. So, but next, Michael, I don't know. I saw you lowered your hand. I don't know if you still had a question.
Yeah, no, I'm still here. Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
I'm Michael Ialucci. I'm part of Power Unity with Artie and Rhodes Harbor, and I have my own business here in New York. And we have a biodiesel research facility here in New York. We're looking at scaling that. And I've been working with some of the leaders in the bio field here in hemp for quite a while. I know about 5 or 6 facilities in New York or in the United States right now, either in the process of making biodiesel out of hemp or, redesigning their facilities. I've contacted most of them and put them on with HempCoin so that we can help do the analytics and help decentralize that system and work together to get some of this data. I'm also working with another person in the Indian tribes to create training programs so that we can actually create the jobs while we're creating the infrastructure to support what we're building. And so I think that there is a full scale conversation that needs to happen to implement these things. One of the things that it's been a long conversation here, and one of the things that came up was the alternative products. So we were in the process of building one of the first hemp co-ops in Colorado a few years back. And we were focusing on utilizing the patent for omega-3s isolated and then converting the waste into oil or into gas. And so I guess I wanted to ask what you guys thought about taking the omega-3 out and providing the 400 patented drugs it competes against as a base to potentially doing this and then going to the oil. I guess, do you see like extracting certain molecules out of it prior to going to the diesel operation, making it more of a viable option?
So typically when you look at the makeup of the extract of a hemp seed, right, the majority of that free fatty acid content will be C18 oleic, right? I've looked at these profiles, and we've actually messed with looking at profiling what's in the oil, because in cannabis and hemp, they want to remove these long chain waxes, C40s and the C18s, because they want to purify the C21, which is the THC and CBD. I think it's C21 or C22, I forget, but we're basically separating those out. So when I've done this, I haven't seen a lot of the, when you say omega-3, which carbon chain is that? Is that how long is that one? Hold on, let me look up. I'm trying to determine if, because I don't think I see a lot of it in the hemp oil.
Well, you don't. It's not in CBD. It's in the hemp seed oil. So it's coming from the seed. And it is, and her patent, she hasn't really been activated on her patent because she's been waiting for the right funding and the right partners. We did go to Bayer, and Bayer passed her up because they were upset that they lost it. She basically took the patent on CBD isolated from those other guys, and then she basically replaced omega-3 with it using that same process so that she could have a competitive product to GW Pharmaceutical. And
now the omega-3 is pretty big. It's saying here it's a C60.
Okay.
It's a really big one. So most of the stuff I get I could send you a thing where it shows you hemp seed hearts, and when they're pressed what the composition is, right? And it shows, you'll see how much of it's polyunsaturated fats and how much of it is free fatty acid. And it's mostly C18. And then it goes down there, there's some C16. So I'd have to think about what you're asking, right? But in general, yeah, a C60 is not hard to get out if it's big like that.
Right. I'm saying pull it out early and then utilize that as a high-end, high-quality, pharmaceutical grade product that you're competing in the market with, seeing that it competes directly with, fish oil and other, omega-3 sources. It's isolated. So, I didn't know about a lot of this stuff, but omega-3 converts to cannabinoids in your body. So it may replace CBD in certain places. It's also a GRAS approved product.
Okay, here we go.
So I was just thinking if there may be some, they're like taking that off the front end.
Okay, here we go.
Allow more value in the entire value, stream, right? Because if you could take off something that was worth and a lot more, that may make it more viable because you're pulling off
Michael, we could talk about this offline. I'm doing a little research. I think the stuff I'm talking about, even the C18, linoleic, and those are all considered omega-3s. The omega-3 is actually a category of a bunch of compounds that are hexadonic acids. So I think we need to take this offline, but I think in general, I could help you with your problem. That's what we do, is separations.
I think we got lots of work to do because, the knowledge that needs to be synergized, I think you got a lot of, input and information to make these more efficient, because it's going to take the grouping, the team of everybody around the globe to make these processes as efficient as possible, because they're not viable if we don't make them efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question, and then we're gonna jump off. Bruce, you go ahead. And then as people are jumping off, I just really quick want to say thank you for anybody that we miss. This will be recorded. I'll send out an email with the links and notes. So you guys will have everything. It should be out within the next week as soon as we're done editing and transcribing. So go ahead, Bruce. It's all you.
Mandy, thank you. Every one of your episodes is just absolutely wonderful. Ahmed, thank you so much. I've been looking for a hemp-based fuel since 2015 to put into my hemp car. And the closest thing I could get was a cellulosic biobutanol that I had to have shipped in for free, thank goodness, from China. They made it from corn silver. But I gave up on investigating the whole, or even hoping that a hemp fuel would come around. So I hope you're really successful as you go forward with this. This is so encouraging. But I wanted to ask you one question. Did you ever hear of a company called Blue Planet years ago that was coming up with they were using a pyrolysis process, and they would take any plant material. It didn't have to be hemp necessarily. Any plant material, pyrolyze it, capture the syngas coming out of it, turning it into methanol, eventually turning it into gasoline. But the biochar that was one of the byproducts, which was like 30% of the mass, could be tilled back into the ground, and thereby that made that fuel carbon negative. Have you ever heard of that? And whatever happened to that technology was real or not?
You're on mute. You're on mute, sir. Ahmed.
All right, sorry, you had to give me a second here. My poor laptop was dying. I'm scrambling to get to a charger before I lose you guys. I had not heard of Blue Planet. I'd have to go back and look at what they did. Were they? I'm sorry, I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, they touted a carbon negative fuel because the biochar, which is a byproduct, 30% of the mass could be tilled back into the soil. So it was actually carbon negative. It's going beyond this, this world where we say that carbon neutral is great, but carbon negative is really great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Terry, have you heard of them? Had you heard anything about the carbon negative fuel?
Yeah. This is all I care about really at this point. So, but yeah, I've heard of this group, and it does seem like a legit way to do this. again, it depends on the LCAs and really doing it right and setting your boundary conditions to maximize the reality of whether it really is carbon negative or not. I think that it's the whole thing about sequestration. Are you really sequestering or not? These are the questions that come into play here. And it's not easy. It's a hard problem because whenever you're using energy, it's very intensive, energy intensive. So it's a big challenge, and it's something I've been writing grants on. Every grant I have, it has something about a piece in there to be able to really find out that answer. So, in fact, we're in the middle of a grant at this moment, writing one for Department of Energy, and it has a major component in there about the carbon negative aspects using life cycle assessments, techno-economic analysis, kind of pulling it all together, sort of a quadruple bottom line type of approach.
I was following this company for a while, and then all of a sudden they got invested in by a big oil company, and it disappeared.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the way it's been going in the last.
Biofuel,
a lot of
biofuel is going to be a big part of the solution. It's going to be huge, just huge.
Yeah, if it's done right, if it's sustainably done, it could be a solution. If it's not, it could be a disaster too. So, yeah.
I'm curious. I would love to learn more, but thank you guys very, very much for joining. I really appreciate you. This is every Thursday. Next week, I guess, is June 1st. So on Tuesday is our carbon meeting, and then Thursday is another series education as well. They'll be posted on YouTube. I'll include them in the next meeting that goes out, or in the link meeting, the notes that we send out as well. Other than that, you guys, thank you very, very much.
Will the Thursday meeting,
great presentation.
What'd you say, Artie?
Will the Thursday meeting be at the same time?
Same time, every week at the same time. And it's a reoccurring link. So the link you used today is the same link for every meeting. And eventually I will change to have a platform where it's not the same, or we can promote it in advance, but it's really hard keeping track of 12 links a month that are all different. So I try to make it simple as I can for everybody. But other than that, thank you guys. I really, really appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Mandy.
Happy holidays. Thank you, Ahmed.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed.